MMO. What?
Welcome back to MMO What. It's been a long time, but I've finally been able to pick this project back up, and I do apologize for that long hiatus. But without further ado, let's get right back into it. As promised, we're talking about controls in a massively multiplayer online role-playing game, or MMORPG for short. Before we hop back into Guild Wars 2, our example in this series, we first need to cover some additional topics. Let's jump back to the infancy of video games. Early video game developers were constantly seeking new ways to create intuitive, user-friendly ways for people to play their games. Many popular control schemes were adopted and evolved into the present day, while some others simply fell to the wayside, so to speak. I'm sure many of you have at least played a game or two on a traditional console controller, such as an Xbox or a PlayStation. But how do you play such complicated games, usually in 3 dimensions, on a mouse and keyboard, especially when you're so used to using those for word processing or browsing the web? Luckily, after some trial and error, some very clever people figured it out for us. We'll get back to one of them shortly. If, like many, you've ever slacked off at school or work by playing flash games, you're fairly familiar with the arrow keys being used for movement. This works wonderfully in a 2-dimensional space when you only need to move side to side and jump. But with games like first-person shooters and, of course, MMORPGs, there's a whole nother dimension we need to worry about. 3-dimensional space. That's where our trusty mouse comes in. Let's think of it this way. With controls being demonstrated on 2 different control schemes, controller and mouse and keyboard. Let's say we're controlling you. For this example, we'll use a first-person game.
Hello.
The arrow keys control the direction you want to move. Pressing the up arrow walks you in the direction you're facing. The back arrow makes you walk backwards. And the left and right either move you side to side or turn your body left or right. The mouse itself essentially controls your head. Generally, moving the mouse forward will make you look up, moving it back, you look down. And left to right, of course, look left or right, respectively. Just as a side note, while we used a first-person game as our example, it is worth noting that in most MMOs, a held-down right click is usually necessary to rotate the camera with the mouse. Nevertheless, simple enough concept, right? Well, if you place your left hand on the arrow keys and your right hand on the mouse, it feels, well, a bit cramped having to reach across your body like that. But things get even more complicated when you introduce additional game elements, basically other keys that you need to press. In our example game, Guild Wars 2, several additional keys are used as well for movement and interaction. Particularly, we utilize the spacebar for jumping and the non-number pad number keys, 1 through 0, for character abilities, such as spells or attacks. So, if you place your hands back on the arrow keys and mouse as before, try reaching for the spacebar or a number key along the top bar. Not exactly user-friendly, right? Well, those clever people we mentioned before, one of those guys was Dennis Fong, a competitive player of an old first-person shooter game called Quake. Fong found that with such a drastic reach distance to access some of Quake's game controls, it was hindering his gameplay experience. His solution? Well, essentially just move the arrow keys closer to our number keys and spacebar. Fong chose to utilize the keys W, A, S, and D as pseudo arrow keys since they formed a similar inverted T and were much closer to the keys he needed to use. Not to mention, it was far more ergonomic. This took the gaming world by storm, so to speak, and WASD is now the most common movement control scheme in computer gaming. Anyway, if we treat WASD as our new arrow keys, we can comfortably place our left thumb on the spacebar to rest and our left pinky on shift. When we need to hit a number, all we need to do is simply reach with our middle or pointer fingers, which are resting on WASD. Don't get me wrong, while this episode doesn't cover every aspect of control in an MMORPG, it does cover the basics that will get you moving around the new virtual world you've entered. Our next episode will continue to dive into controls, as they tend to be the biggest barrier to overcome when diving into an MMORPG. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you next time. Hey gang, if you found this video helpful, go ahead and hit that like button. Want to continue learning? Click the subscribe button and ring that bell so you never miss another upload.